A session that's moderated by Sharon, Tong, and she's going to be joined by speakers Mariah Rachel Arenas, Maria Chin Abdullah, Noeleen Heyzer, and of course Marise Payne, who I spoke to a little earlier. They'll be joining Sharon on stage as soon as the stage is set and ready. And let's put our hands together to welcome this wonderful session, the successes and challenges of modern feminist diplomacy. Please welcome our panelists.
Hello everybody, good day to everyone. It has been a jam-packed 2 days at the Women's Forum here in Singapore, so I thank everyone for going the distance and joining us, me and my panelists, for this next discussion. I know it's a long day. Let me just do a quick introduction. I'm Sharon. I'm a former journalist at Singapore's Asian News Network, Channel News Asia, CNA as it's known now. Currently, my time in the newsroom, I saw how we lost so many great journalists to family life because, you know, there's no great blend between juggling newsroom, especially in a 24-hour news channel, with raising children and being women, mothers and wives. So I decided to come out and we moved to the dark side, and we now consult with companies and teach them the tips and tricks for journalists, you know, how do you deal with journalists, how to control the narrative. And I gathered all the people that I saw were lost from the newsroom. 16 years, 20 years of experience, and I brought them back into the workforce to share their experience and to coach and consult along with me. So that's been a great journey in almost 10 years that I've done this. So I'm very, very excited, very honored to have three incredibly awesome women sitting here on the stage with me today. Now, before I introduce them a little bit deeper, I'd like to do a quick preamble about what we'll be talking about in the next 40 minutes. Now, we're talking about feminist diplomacy, women diplomacy, feminist foreign policy, gender equality diplomacy. Now, they're all labels, different labels, and they've all been talked about multiple times, yet for some, it's still an alien concept. But women diplomacy isn't a new discussion. Back in the 1980s, researchers highlighted the gender gap in public opinion on foreign policy, and they suggested that perhaps having more women in these roles could inject fresh and innovative ideas, especially in peace and security. Today, 40 years later, we're still having this debate on just how much foreign policy can change with more women in government roles, right? Till today, in this field, we're still seeing women being underrepresented. The debate still goes on about what contributions and influence they can have to policy. So that's exactly what we'll be discussing today. Have we progressed? Certainly, I hope so. But according to UN Women, if we continue at the current clip, it'll take another 286 years before discriminatory practices are gone. I think no one in this room is going to be here in 286 years. But the question is, what can we do today so that perhaps some of us may live to see the objectives of feminist diplomacy live to its fullest potential? Right, so let me just do a quick introduction. To my left is Maria Chin Abdullah, former member of the House of Representatives in Malaysia. Maria is also a social activist who champions the rights of both women as well as human rights issues. Next to her is Noeleen Heyzer, the former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations. She was also the Executive Director of the UN Development Fund for Women, and she played a pivotal role in the UN Security Council's adoption and implementation of the landmark 1325 resolution. on women, peace and security. Finally, she was gracing the stage earlier, Marise Payne, former Australian Minister for Defence and Foreign Affairs and the current Professor of Practice in International Relations and Public Policy at Western Sydney University. Another label, she said, recovering politician, right, earlier today. So, ladies, welcome. Now, this whole 2 days at the Women's Forum, we've been talking about education. So that's where I want to start, right? Explore the full potential of education, being critical to empower women, foster economic, social, and political transformation. So let me start with you, Maria. In Malaysia, more girls than boys are in the Malaysian universities. We're also seeing more women who've achieved a higher educational attainment than men. It's not translating to a greater representation in the House of Representatives where you are. I think the latest figure puts it at 13% female representation, and that's a second consecutive year of decline. Why do you think that's the case?
Yeah, thank you very much. I guess it comes down to how do we actually value women's participation. Yeah, Malaysia has not actually done so well in terms of, even though we have a commitment towards 30% women's participation in our national plans. But at the end of the day, I feel that, we have to really fight very hard for it. As a former member of parliament, even in parliament, we have to really push very hard for more women candidates, more inclusion of the concept of gender equality, gender mainstreaming into the policies and laws. So, but for me, at the end of the day, it is really about political will, whether we want to include women. And I think that it makes a big difference if we were to talk about gender equality and non-discrimination, because at the present moment, we are looking at the same old strategy, the same old approaches, and expecting a different result. Yeah, but I feel that if we were to include gender equality and non-discrimination, include more women into decision-making position, it will make a big difference. And I just give a small example of what some of the women members of parliament did in Malaysia. We actually formed this all-party parliamentary group on sustainable development goals. And one of the things that we insisted on was that whenever we do a project at the parliament constituency, gender equality must be the main concern. And we go down and we also make an insistence, that the community needs to be part of it, especially women and young girls. So the project actually ran for 3 years now. And it's actually reaching out to quite a lot of women and girls, and even young boys, the youth participation. So, and it gives a different dimension to the kind of projects that are being run. Instead of just only infrastructure, we have education for the refugees, we have healthcare for the migrant, the children, the stateless children that we have in Malaysia still. So it actually shows that, if we are more open towards including women with the rights perspective, of course, we will get different results and we will get different outcomes. That's how I feel.
Right. Political will you mentioned. So how do you think, one more briefly, how do you think you can change the political will?
I'm not sure about changing the political will. It's actually persuading those who are in power to have that political will. And it really has to come from a lot of work on the women, particularly civil society, working together with women members of parliament to actually make the laws and policies count.
Right. So, Marise, I think Australia has seen good success in this area. And you've filled what we call hard portfolios as well, being the former Minister for Defense, former Minister for Foreign Affairs as well. Share your experience on that, because I've also read about in Parliament in Australia, there could also be something they call blokey culture, because they're just you're in a traditionally male-dominated space.
Thank you, Sharon. It's fair to say that the Australian political culture has its moments, and historically has certainly been described like that. We have made significant strides. My political party, not as many as I would like, if I'm absolutely frank. And that's notwithstanding significant efforts from my peers, people like me, and my predecessors who have tried over a long period of time. But it's not as good as it should be, and there's unfortunately more work to do in that regard. The current government, which is from the other side of politics to me, has been quite successful. They have a different approach though, and that explains it, at least in part, in terms of how they pre-select and choose their candidates. But it is fair to say that I've often been in the room as the only woman in the room. And that happened a lot in defence, and that is absolutely not a complaint. Every minute of my role as Australia's Defence Minister was an extraordinary honour for me to lead the women and the men of the Australian Defence Force and the Defence Public Service as their minister. But it is an environment in which you look around and suddenly see, yes, you are the only woman in the room. And that happened for me over many years, and I never, ever allowed it to be a problem for me. And I think that is in part a choice, and as I said to some of you earlier today, it's important to take every opportunity that presents itself if you are keen to pursue a particular pathway, and I most certainly was. Don't say no, even if it's not a perfect fit. Take the opportunity, take the meeting, take the role, and make sure that you obviously do well. That said, being able to represent Australia on the world stage as both Defence and Foreign Minister, on both occasions I found myself as Defence Minister with my partner in the Foreign Affairs portfolio as Julie Bishop, a name that will be familiar to many of you. So when Australia walked into meetings as the Defence Minister and the Foreign Minister, they met two Australian women from opposite sides of the country, and I was always very proud of that. During my period of time as Foreign Minister, Australia's Defence Minister was a woman called Linda Reynolds for part of that time. We did the same thing, walking into rooms as the Australian National Security Team, as it were, and really standing up for our country, for our interests, but also working incredibly closely with our partners and our allies and countries like Singapore in this region in particular. So it has certainly had its moments. Some are probably best shared over either a cup of tea or a glass of wine than with a microphone, and I might have been known to do that in the past. But nevertheless, I'm really proud of what I managed to achieve through that process.
Totally inspired by what you've just said, but essentially, besides having the will and not letting it affect you, and I'm also directing this at my two other panelists as well, what were your biggest challenges walking into a room full of men, being either the only female or one of two, as it was your experience?
Well, some people would say I have obsessive compulsive disorder. I don't agree with that. I just like to be prepared. And I always think that if you prepare yourself as best as you possibly can, and do not leave anything to chance, and make sure that you know what you're talking about, and that if the person opposite you doesn't, that's not your problem. It's theirs. And you always represent yourself and your country, in my case, then to the best of your ability, and completely knowing that you're confident in your own approach. That said, though, I do have experiences in the very far recesses of my mind, which I'd rather not live through again. I have met generals from multiple defence forces around the world who look behind me to the male advisor to see the person that they assume is the Defence Minister. I've gone through security in Heathrow Airport with my aide-de-camp, who was a female flight lieutenant in the Australian Air Force, only to be asked by a female security guard, where's the Defence Minister? That would be her. And the woman looking at me and saying, no, I mean the Minister. And my aide-de-camp, Flight Lieutenant O'Brien, saying that would be her. And having those sorts of conversations, you think in the 2018s, 19s, 2020s, that probably the world was over that by then, but no, not in a lot of places. So you just smile and pick up your bags and keep walking.
Noeleen, did you have those kind of equal challenges in the United Nations?
Maybe let me start by saying that I have spent my whole career, professional career, in the diplomatic space and in the multilateral space. And for me, it was diplomacy to bring about equality, development, and peace to the member states of the United Nations. And if many of you may be too young, but those of you who have participated in the UN Women's Conferences will know that equality, development, and peace are actually the themes of all the UN Women's Conferences, right? And I say that because that is actually the normative framework within which we move this whole work on diplomacy. So for me, what is the best kind of women's diplomacy? And it is actually to be a game changer. It is to be to be engaged with social change, and to be able to reshape forces that have devalued the lives of women, men, and children, and to create institutions and societies that can actually provide greater fairness, inclusiveness, and also sustainability. So within that kind of a framework, I mean, what is the moral compass in the multilateral space is actually the UN Charter, which every single member state actually signed up to. And what does it say in this charter? The charter actually promises dignity and respect to every individual in every country, and for each one to be able to live free from want and free from fear. But these are all aspirations, right? So how? So what do we do? So for me, it was an opportunity to actually see whether we can actually make a difference to real people's lives on the ground. And that's where the best of the UN multilateral work can be done. So it's to be with the countries, is at the ground level. So one of the maybe an example that I will share, which will also show how difficult it is to work, to change things, right? Because it's so good to think that it is possible to do it. But you have to be very tough, and you have to have courage, and you are not alone. You have to be very aware that actually a lot of the work comes from collective leadership. A collective, and the knowing how to build relationships, and knowing how to move power in very interesting ways. So let me give you the example of what I did with the Security Council. And you know that the Security Council is very male-dominated, and also it actually sees its whole paradigm in terms of peace and security, but very often it is weapon-based peace and security. So there was in the middle of the 90s up to 2000, many of you know that there was a horrible genocide in Rwanda and in Bosnia at the heart of Europe. And sexual violence was used horribly, and nobody wants to talk about it. It was not even seen as a crime. And a group of women leaders in the conflict-affected countries decided that we have to make this a crime. And we have to ensure that there is no impunity for such a crime. And so they then asked me to help to deal with Security Council. But I said to them that if we want to end sexual violence in conflict, it is not just ending sexual violence, it's to end the conflict themselves. So how do we actually make sure that there is sustainable peace? And when I looked at all the issues, all the countries, there are now 55 active conflicts, and some are so horrible, we won't even talk about it here. But if you look at the conflicts that have come to the Security Council table, even when they say that they have mediated peace, it reoccurs after 5 years. So in other words, the peace is not sustainable. So we put all this together and decided, and they said, can we change the rule of the game? Can we actually change the paradigm of peace and security? So firstly, it is a male bastion, but at the same time, there you go. Can you go in and not be afraid of that bastion? Because you're going to face a lot of resistance, and I won't tell you the amount of resistance. But then we worked 1 year, and I was able to mobilize all my partners, people with power in the system and outside of the system, member states and so on, in order to put this agenda onto the Security Council table, and eventually it was. And I was invited to speak to the Security Council. So basically, there were several things that I did. So firstly is to make sure that sexual violence is seen as a crime. And that was kind of there. But equally is to say that you can't have sustainable peace without looking at what are the drivers of conflict. And normally it is fractured societies, very deep inequalities economically and socially, bad governance system, and a lot of corruption. And therefore, it has to be done in a more holistic way that looks at human security, human development, and human rights. In other words, peace and security is not a pillar unto itself. And of course, they were actually relatively shocked at my engagement because I was supposed to belong to the development pillar. And I said there's no development without peace and security, and there's no peace and security without development. And therefore, we have to begin to think not in silos, but in a more integrated way. And that was already a big change in mindset before they would even take on many of our issues. So eventually, the 1325, or Security Council 1325, which is important because it is international law. It is international law, and all countries have to obey it. But there were 4 pillars that I focused on. One is prevention. How do we prevent conflict? How do we deal with the root causes? Secondly, when conflict occurs, where's the protection? What do we put in place to kind of protect? And thirdly, participation. Who have you excluded? Whose voices have you not heard? And then the fourth one is peace building and recovery. What kind of societies do you want to build in order to have sustainable peace? And it has to be peace with justice. So I say all this because eventually it was passed. And it was passed in 2000. But me being me and all my women leaders and friends and people on the ground said, all right, we have rules, we have laws, and we have norms. Make it work in a real case situation. So many of us went to the ground, and this is where the real struggles would come in. So maybe I'll just give one example, because there were some very good examples. I think my experience with Liberia was very good because we managed to get the first woman president elected, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was my consultant for that work, actually, which is fantastic. But then the other thing, but the other one was in Afghanistan. And here it was not easy. But we managed to get the Constitution of Afghanistan to recognize the equal citizenship rights of women and girls. And that one, at that time, allowed 3.5 million women and girls to enter into education and into primary, secondary, and university. But then look at what has happened. So you talk about the gaps. We can make headways, but if we do not deal with the backlash, and if we do not know how to prevent the gains that we have made from being destroyed, that is another struggle. Let me stop here.
So Maria, how do you see it on the ground, the implementation of something that's decided on a multilateral level, but on the ground, exactly what Noeleen was saying, how do you make sure it's implemented and that it sticks?
I think Noeleen actually answered that question. You have to really start with the people who are affected by whatever decisions or by whatever situations. Because without asking the people on the ground, you will not get the right actions. And I find it all the time, especially when we started this APPGM, that when we leave out the women, we leave out a lot of things that could have actually made the recovery much faster. So definitely you have to start from the ground and not take a easy way out and say that, you come in and say that it's infrastructure, or you have a predetermined opinion of the situation. The people know what they want. And it's important that if we want any change and we want different results, we have to start with the people. That's how I feel.
I can give you a really good example that I was told about when I was Defence Minister, and where we live, we are subject to significant natural disasters regularly in our region. One of those was a catastrophic cyclone that hit Fiji, Tropical Cyclone Winston. And Australia was part of a very significant response to that cyclone, sent our largest ship, HMAS Canberra, to Fiji. As part of that, you can embark thousands of crew on that, including all of the engineers and logisticians that you need to work out how to address the damage from the natural disaster, and so on. Because of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, the Australian Defence Force had started to use gender advisors in their work, in a very broad range of work, but also in humanitarian assistance in disaster response. And that's thanks to people like Noeleen, Heyzer, quite frankly, because Security Council Resolution 1325 would not have come about without their determination and their passion and their focus, and we owe them a lot. That said, I do know that the Australian military went with their Royal Fiji Military Force colleagues into a particular village, and the engineers and the logisticians were good to go. They knew exactly what needed to be rebuilt, and they would do that road and that bridge and that street and that piece of telecommunications infrastructure, that power, all those sorts of things. And the gender advisors' role was to make sure, as Maria has just said, is that the entire community is consulted on the response. The entire community is part of determining what should be in the response, and that includes the women. And so on this occasion, and it was early in the use of gender advisors in the ADF in these circumstances, on this occasion, when that community meeting was held, the discussion wasn't about fixing that bridge and that road and that piece of telecommunications infrastructure. It was a very serious discussion about the importance of fixing the schools first. And the reason for that is because everyone in the community wanted to help with the disaster response, but they couldn't, and particularly in that community in Fiji, particularly the women couldn't until they knew that their children would be safe. And their children would be safe if they could go back to school, if teachers could go back to work, and if children were in a proper structure, protected from the elements, and able to get on with their lives. That helps deal with their trauma, the children's trauma, helps their parents deal with their care. It makes a profound difference to the disaster response. And I was immensely proud when I was told that story. Our gender advisors in the ADF are women and men. And if they don't lead that conversation when Australia is participating in disaster response, it probably doesn't happen. So for all of the good intentions of the engineers and the logisticians, women and men both in those tasks, that community input involving everyone in the community, just like Maria said, is so profoundly important. And without UN Security Council Resolution 1325, then those steps are often not taken. And it makes a real difference. So thank you again, Noeleen.
That's right. We are in a particularly harsh security and political context. So my question is, how do you prevent one step forward, two steps back situation? Noeleen, you brought in an example of Afghanistan just now. So how do we make sure there's no backslides? I believe the UN Sec-Gen Antonio Guterres mentioned that he's seeing a backsliding of gender equality processes. So I would say, what in your opinion is the one thing, most important thing, that will bring this process forward and not let us wait centuries for change to be made? And I open this question to any of you on stage with me. In your opinion, the one most important?
I think it's very hard, I'm sorry, Sharon, to narrow the field to one thing. But if you really forced me to do that, I would probably say education. I would probably say education of girls and boys in equal environments with a gender equality aware education system. And although we in the 21st century in 2024 would probably like to think in our own countries that that was pretty much where we were, I'm not sure that that is the case. No, in fact, I'm confident it's not the case universally. So if you asked me for one, I would say that. Beyond that, I would revert to some of the things that I said earlier today about women's economic security, women's participation in leadership roles, and frankly, women and children's safety from family and domestic violence, which I regard as one of the most atrocious scourges on our societies in the modern world.
Just a quick follow-up before I hear from the other two is being in Western Sydney University, how do you educate those you are teaching at the university?
I think that's a really good question. Western Sydney University is fortunate to have some very significant women leaders, and I think their contribution is invaluable in that regard, but they are also very, very careful to address gender equality in all of their disciplines and to make sure that their leaders are acutely aware of the priorities that they expect. I make guest appearances from time to time in the International Studies course, for example, and it probably has a fairly even gender breakdown in terms of students who are taking that course. I attended a law graduation at Western Sydney University on Friday, and it broke 70-30 women to men. I was fascinated by that and very proud to watch all those new lawyers emerging into the community, but particularly those women who will make a real change, I'm confident. So the university builds that in and they are very, very focused on doing that, and that is essential.
Thank you. Noeleen, what is the one important step that you believe needs to get done?
Yeah, I would say courage and community, and maybe let me explain. I think if we look at where we were historically, we have to remember the legacy of courage of the women who fought such a long time ago to bring us here today. Women didn't have the vote, they didn't have education, they didn't have the right to work, decent work, and so on. The thing is that we have to accept the fact that there are literally steps. Certain times, if you can read the environment well, you will know a window of opportunity has opened, and you take it and you run with it. And you really move as fast as you can, so that even if there was 2 steps backwards, it is better than what it was before. The thing then is that how we are living in a very troubled times in terms of peace and security in the world today, especially because there is actually non-compliance with the international rule of law. And how then do we keep our spirit alive? And we need, in the worst of time, to keep the flame of hope alive. And you can only do that through having very strong communities, very strong relationships, and also not to give up, and to know who are the people who are change makers. So I come back to the time that we are actually people engaged as people who bring about social change, and we are game changers, and we can take our time, and we will be able to read at least as intelligently as we can, because we are now better educated. We have also social media and so on to build the transnational community that we need to be able to turn over the kind of power, so that I believe that at the end of the day, we have to make sure that the nature of power do not change women, but that women can change the nature of power.
Thank you. Just a very quick call out to any questions you may have. Just raise your hand and the microphone will come to you. There's one right up here in front. And then I'll come to you to wrap up, Maria.
Thank you so much. Is it okay to have 2 questions?
Yes, sure.
Okay. So I have 2 questions. So the first question is to address to Noeleen. So I'm also like in peace and security and diplomacy and working on the WPS. So as it has been 24 years already since the UN Security Council Resolution 1325. So as one of the contributors, in your opinion, how far have we came already, and there are a lot more to be done? And what would be the first priority, like in your perspective? And the second question addressed to Marise. So I'm speaking here like as a woman from Southeast Asia, and there is an average of only under 20% of women in defense sector in Southeast Asia. And I see that we need a lot more women in this sector, especially like in leaderships, like women leaderships like in defense. So do you have any recommendations on what suits what ASEAN should be done, like to increase or empower women in defense? Thank you.
Right. Let's hear from Noeleen first, if you could try and keep your responses pretty brief.
I think what actually Marise has said is the best example of how to make 1325 work. It's at the country level, it's at the local level. It is actually making sure that the communities, so what Maria has also said, that the people understand that there is actually an international legal framework that can be used to hold whoever accountable. And I think at the end of the day, it is about shaming as well if things are not done.
Marise.
I'm big on name and shame. I think it's can be a very effective tool. Thank you for your question. And I would never presume to give advice to other countries about how to run their military. But in an effective sense, obviously the mentoring and the leaders as they come to the Defence Force, whether it's the Navy and Air Force, is absolutely essential. I remember the first time I a 2-star in the Australian Air Force, or 3-star, the Chief Information Officer, of the Royal Australian Air Force. I was a time ago, it was 15 years ago perhaps. Her name was Julie Hammer. Absolutely thrilled I had met someone so a woman in that role in the Royal Australian Air Force. There have been since more stars, more women as 3 stars, but there is a lot to go, and I must make a very good point. Experience with Defence Forces in Southeast Asia. I can't count a lot of women that I have met at those levels. So I think there's a role for Australian senior women in the military to reach out to counterparts in the region as well, and we should do more of that. And I might actually take that home with me and think about it a bit more.
Maria, we have to wrap up, but I'd like to just leave one last thought in your hands. Do you have one?
Yeah, I certainly agree that, we need to do the education part. But I would also want to emphasize that the education has also been extended to decision makers. People who actually do the laws, do the policies, they have to be educated. Because in Malaysia, we have a gender equality training for the civil servants. But that has been dropped like 5 years ago. And we need to actually do that because while we are aiming for the youth and the community, we also cannot forget the policymakers because they are still there, okay? And they're making a lot of decisions that actually excludes the communities and also women and youth.
Thank you very much. It leaves me now just to thank 3 amazing women here with me for being so generous with their insights. Thank you for being a lovely audience. And thank you, Women's Forum, for having us. May the conversations continue to flow. Have a good evening.